Hey guys, so today we're going to look at enterprise as the final factor of production. So enterprise is the factor of production that organises the other factors of production, so that are land, labour and capital, into a production unit, and that unit produces a good or service. And the most important thing here is that it undertakes all inherent risks in the hope of making a profit. So the idea is that the entrepreneur combines these three, and that by combining these three there's a risk involved. So the fact of the matter is that when they combine these three, they hope to make a profit, and the risk involved is that they may make a loss. When we look at enterprise and why it's unique, so the first reason that it's unique is that it's the only factor that can return a negative return, and that's a loss. So we've talked about land, which the return on land is rent. We've talked about labour, the return on labour is wages. And the third one, capital, was interest. But for enterprise, they can also make a negative return, which is a loss. The second thing then is that the returns can vary, so they can have supernormal profits, they can have normal profits, or they can have losses. So it can just depend on the entrepreneur themselves and how much experience that they have, and the choices that they make regarding their enterprise. And the last thing then, return is residual. So enterprise receives its return only after the other factors of production receive theirs. So with an entrepreneur, they must make sure that they've paid the rent on land, they've paid the wages of their labour, and if they have any capital outstanding, so for example, if they have loans on machinery, that they've paid their loan repayment plus interest. And then they can think about their profits afterwards. So when we look at a lot of small or medium enterprises in Ireland, the first year they may not make a profit, or they may just break even, or they may make a small loss, but they know in the long run they'll make profit. That short-term loss could be just costs associated with setting up a company. So for example, buying all the machinery, employing the staff initially, buying the premises, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to note that because we are a small open economy, entrepreneurship is so important for us. So because we're a small and open economy, we depend massively on exports, and that's where our growth tends to be focused on, export-led growth. So in that sense then, first of all, when we see entrepreneurship, when it develops in Ireland, it creates employment in the private sector. And we talked about that before, that employment in the private sector is a good thing because you have private companies then paying wages, as opposed to employment in the public sector, which the government pays their wages. They organise production units, so they may be more efficient than if the public sector was to try and develop an industry. Decides what commodities will be produced by anticipating consumer demand, so there's no waste, or there's less waste of scarce resources, because they see what the demand is and then they produce goods accordingly. Decides what prices to be charged, so they think about, so they might do some market research, they look at their costs, they may be able to get discounts on their costs because they're able to buy in bulk. Encourages further investment. So for example, if we look at Cocoa Brown, this is a tannin product, the girls might know about this. So Cocoa Brown, that lady Marissa Carter now has a beauty line called Carter Beauty. She's going to expand into skincare now as well. So that's further investment, because the moment she decides to branch into another type of product, then what happens is she's going to have to take on more staff. So that's further investment. Similarly, if we look at Avamore, this is protein milk produced by Avamore. Avamore traditionally just produced normal milk, and now they're going into different products. So they have things like Moo Juice, some of you may know that product, and protein milk. So the more that the different industries that they enter, they also do things like soup. So like that's another type of food. That's going to see further investment, and they're going to have to take on more staff. They may have to borrow more money, they may have to buy more machinery and so on, and that creates further investment. And you see then Fulfill bars. These are the really old flavours, the first flavours that came out in Fulfill. Fulfill are an Irish company. Although I think they have been bought now and they're just a product of the EU. But there's like so many more flavours, and that's further investment. Generates revenue for the government, because obviously all these companies will pay corporation tax. So you want to just write that in there, corp tax. So they have to pay corporation tax to the government. And finally, it creates wealth in the economy. So on that note, it's really important to know that the government have to try and encourage this enterprise, because enterprise is such a good thing and entrepreneurship is such a good thing for a small open economy like Ireland. They have to try and encourage it. So what factors then do they look at that encourages enterprise? Well, the first one here we have is the existence of an optimistic future. So people may be more inclined to take risks in establishing an enterprise if they think there's an opportunity there, or that the economy is going to do quite well. The second one then, an education system which encourages innovation. So we see the mini company in TY, that's an example of something that promotes innovation. The promotion of enterprise itself. So like the idea that, you know, we teach you about how important enterprise is to the Irish economy. And then, you know, things like schemes or grants to train entrepreneurs. So there would be a number of schemes or grants. So things like train the trainer courses, FOSS courses, night courses that would help the entrepreneur understand certain skills that they may need to set up their business. And then the third one is the availability of low interest rates, which encourage borrowing for startup. So it's easier for them to attain loans for capital, because their startup costs will be quite high, so they will have to borrow. Other factors then, we have a low corporation tax. So our corporation tax is 12.5%, and it minimises the tax liabilities of entrepreneurs, therefore increasing the reward for risk. This fifth one then changes an attitude towards risk taking, so a reduction in bankruptcy to 3 years. So the idea behind this is that if you take a risk and it really badly fails, and you have to declare yourself as bankrupt. So bankruptcy basically means that you say that you have not got the money to repay any of your loans associated with your business. But it has dire effects when you are declared bankrupt, because for 3 years you cannot borrow, you cannot set up another company, you cannot be a director of a company. So that for somebody who's really interested in entrepreneurship, that can be quite difficult. Now 3 years is not that bad. In Ireland it used to be 10 years. So that would be very difficult for somebody trying to start up. For example, if they had an idea and it failed and they became bankrupt, but they had another idea and this one looked like it was going to be very positive or it was going to work. And then the final one is government policy. So funding for new businesses, reduction in legal barriers to entry. So funding for new businesses being like subsidies. They do a VAT scheme now that you don't have to pay VAT for your first year, just to help you set up. There are schemes, they have done schemes before for self-employed people where you're allowed to claim social welfare for the first year while you're setting up your business, just so that you can cover your own costs. And just two terms that I mentioned earlier. So first of all, normal profits. That's the minimum amount of profit an entrepreneur must receive in order to stay in production in the long run. So that's long run. So it's the minimum amount. It's not break even. Break even is when your profit, so I'll just put in break even. Profit. Not profit, it's revenue. So revenue equals costs. So normal profit is not revenue equals costs. It's the minimum amount of profit an entrepreneur must receive in order to stay in production. Supernormal profit. So when we look at normal profits, you might see something like farming. It's normal profits. Supernormal profits, any profit earned by an entrepreneur in excess of normal profit. So for example, when we look at Conor McGregor in the UFC and his business, I suppose, that he runs, that would be considered supernormal profit, excess money. Okay, so when we look here Earnings 60,000, his normal profit is 50,000, then the economic rent there would be 10,000. Okay, so if we look at Conor McGregor, the very first time he won knockout of the night, and I think he got €65,000 for it. I mean, it may only have cost him €5,000 to train, so his economic rent was almost €60,000. But again, we talked about economic rent and how someone like Conor McGregor has an innate talent, and sometimes that's how you can earn economic rent, similar to Ronaldo or any of these top footballers. And then finally, I suppose, why is profit important for an economy? So in developing a modern market economy, first of all, if people see there are profits to be made, it encourages them to take the risk in setting up a business. The second thing, it indicates the best use of resources or consumer demand. So it allows the business to identify where best to use scarce resources. So when you see that there's a profit, normally that's because demand exceeds supply, and supply, then you can increase the price to meet that demand, or to kind of cancel out some consumers in the industry so that the demand level falls to meet the supply. But you can also produce more of that good, which will drop the price as well. But it's the best use of scarce resources. Third of all, it encourages investment. So when you see an economy, or when you see an industry that has the potential to do quite well, then there may be private investment in that industry. There may be investment by the government in that industry. So for example, here we see this in games development at the moment. The government are investing in games development. IT is a sector that they invest in. And then also, I think a really important thing to say is, when they see certain industries doing very well in Ireland, they tend to filter that through into education. So they may try to convince colleges to put more courses on, or give more course places, or allocate more funding to courses. Then you have provides funds for reinvestment and expansion. So profits aren't always split out completely to the shareholders, and if they make €10,000 profit, they split that amongst all the shareholders. That's not how it works. So often what they do is they'll say to the shareholders, we will always retain 10% of profits for reinvestment. So for example, in that case, you would then say to your shareholders, we made €10,000, 1,000 of it is going to be reinvested in the company, and 9,000 will be split amongst the rest of you. And then finally, it's a source of revenue for the government through corporation tax. And that's important because tax, as we know, then is used by the government to develop our economy and develop social infrastructure.